As we lead up to COP17, those climate change talks taking place in Durban at the end of the year, we're focusing on some of the initiatives that might be introduced to reduce global emissions. Now, international shipping is a major and rapidly growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's responsible for about 3% of global emissions. A report has been released which proposes that a carbon levy be introduced by international shipping companies or bunkers to tackle growing greenhouse gas emissions from ships. We're now joined by Dennis Dykes, Chief Economist from Nedbank. He's talking about the viability of a bunker tax. Dennis, as I said, 3% of global emissions bunker emissions are responsible for. Is this a big deal?
Well, the report itself suggests that it won't really increase costs significantly for trade. And I guess whenever you're looking at a tax, you have to say, well, is it meeting the requirements that it's set up to do, which is obviously to combat emissions globally, and then does it raise funds to meet other needs? On the first, I would actually suggest it's not going to be too effective initially, because it's not
in terms of reducing emissions.
In terms of reducing emissions, as you said, it's 3% of total transport costs, and the amount that's been proposed, $25 per ton of fuel, is relatively low. But obviously that could escalate over the next few years. And
because the tax emissions are expected to grow by between 150 to 250% by 2015. So obviously at this point in time emissions are low, but they are projected to grow. So that type of revenue generated could be quite substantial.
That's right. I think the other side is as they raise the tax, because I think that is the implied scenario here. The cost to international trade could become quite big, and that does raise other questions, of course, because you could start forcing production back into home countries with lower economies of scale and maybe less efficient means of production.
Disrupt the competitive positioning at this point in time and the comparative advantage that we have.
That's right, but essentially for carbon emissions, you could force it back into more smokier factories, to put it that way. So that aspect needs to be looked at very carefully. The other aspect, though, is the raising of the cash. And this is a very easy, clean way of raising cash. It's a small number, so it's not going to cause too much alarm. And you can raise quite a significant amount of money to put into the Green Climate Fund, for example.
Before we go on to the Green Climate Fund, let's focus in on the cost to logistics companies, shipping companies, and of course those involved in shipping their products to and from various countries. Has there been a huge outcry from those involved in this sector?
Yeah, I think there's been a certain amount of discomfort. I mean, clearly, if you're in a particular industry, you don't want to be discriminated against, and that's another sort of tax principle, is that you want the tax to be to actually impact generally, in this case, on carbon emissions more generally. So there's always a concern that maybe it's actually picking out a particular industry, a particular sector for focus, when maybe the focus should be elsewhere. Which it is, obviously. There are many different proposals.
This is just one of the avenues to look at reducing that gap in terms of how much we should be emitting and how much science is saying would cause dangerous emissions.
No, absolutely. I mean, very, very clearly we need to actually look at emissions a lot more seriously than we have in the past. And we need to actually try and, I think there should maybe be even a tax on per capita emissions in various countries, but politically, obviously, that's not going to necessarily fly.
If you're bringing it back down to that, just taking it away from the bunker tax for the moment, I mean, South Africa is really up there when we're talking about per capita, so that would have a huge implication for the South African economy if you're going to be taxing per capita.
No, absolutely. Of course, we're not amongst the big offenders. The big offenders are mainly in the developed and obviously China and so forth.
And Saudi Arabia is up on that list.
Absolutely.
Of course, small population.
Very much so. And of course, I think anything that's done now needs to be a signal, which can later, and a path towards, so that companies and people and countries can actually adjust.
Yeah.
So, I'm against anything that just leads to a sudden full stop in activity, because that could be immensely damaging, particularly in the current international environment.
So coming back to the bunker tax, just looking at some of the facts put on the table by WWF, they're saying it would cause a rise in cost to shipping companies of 0.2%, or for every $1,000 traded, and it could generate $25 billion a year at this point in time, which could go towards the Green Climate Fund. That being said, it's been on the table for 10 years. They haven't been able to pass it. Is it likely that we might get some progress at COP17? And are you for or against bunker tax overall?
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's been on the table for some time. It's got quite a bit of support. There was some discussion at G20. The Australians have been looking at this sort of tax in quite a bit of detail. The stumbling blocks have always been around the incidents, that certain countries will be discriminated against more than others. So I think there will be a healthy discussion. I'm not 100% sure that it would actually go ahead, but at least it's a good discussion document that can be put on the table and
you
possibly
for or against?
I'm for emissions taxes, but I think they need to be looked at very carefully before they're put in place, so that we don't actually have unintended consequences that emerge from them over time.